Welcome to the FLF podcast by J3VC. I'm joined again by my fabulous co-host and his possibly even more fabulous t-shirt today, looking absolutely fantastic, Jason. How you doing today, Jason?
Very well, very well.
Well, today is going to be a great one. This is going to be fantastic. We're going to talk about building business relationships, like long-term business relationships, on how to really maximize the value by going out there and connecting with people and helping each other and in a way that can really help the listener in their life. So I'm excited about this one.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical. All of life is relationships.
Yeah, the whole thing is basically just relationships. So why don't we start with authenticity and trust? So could you explain to us why I think we do business in a very, very similar way, that sincerity and honesty is the backbone of all quality business relationships, and why transparency is so important as well?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I've had some feedback in the last week or so as I've met some new people and some conversations that I've had recently. And one of the things that I've noticed and gotten feedback on is, especially when you're meeting new people and starting to get to know them, the conversation goes along, the relationship really starts to solidify once you have a peek into the person's values and whether your values are shared, as well as what your long-term goals and intentions are. And so that kind of, once you discover that, you see if there's overlap there. And I think that reflects back into what you were saying about authenticity and trust. You're trying to find points of contact and overlap to see if there's trustworthiness and authenticity, because that's going to make you distinct and unique. And I've noticed that happen, very recently in a couple of interactions. How about for you?
Well, I think, yeah, this is incredibly important. But I'm curious when you say trying to find overlap. So how would a person do that? Or could you please give us an example of how they would find that overlap?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. I was meeting with another developer here in Bali, and, I was trying to understand from what they're trying to accomplish and some of their goals. And they're trying to raise capital through some family offices, like some high net worth individuals. And, we have some relationships in that space and in that area. And so, there's some overlap. We may be raising money from same types of people, targeting similar businesses. So, after we kind of establish some trust and some rapport, I'm more than happy to share information or contacts or whatever. So that's what I mean about overlap. We're in slightly different niches within the same industry, but there's some overlap in terms of our overall goals, So yeah, I'm kind of looking for that. Is there anything that where we're doing something, you might be doing something, there's some synergy, there's some overlap, there's some, mutually beneficial place that we can play together. That's what I'm looking for.
Interesting. And connecting this to the idea that long-term value is better than short-term wins with people that are actually worth networking with, I think it's important to highlight that all relationships are transactional in some way. And I think what you said is key, is, providing value and working in a similar space, understanding that and giving back to each other. If both parties are doing it and treating it the same way, that's where I believe where the real magic starts to happen.
Yeah, I had another scenario this week where I bumped into an old, friend and associate, and they're trying to accomplish, they're doing a big project, quite large, and are needing some expertise in interiors, some architectural work, blah, blah, blah. And I immediately had some people to recommend, found out that we're working with another mutual friend. And so I was able to make some connections and bring that together. And, so it was a great, great experience. So, and she even said to me, maybe there's something we can work on. Maybe there's something we can work on, down the road with once this comes into more clarity. So I offered some value. I didn't ask for anything in return. And then I've done that a couple of times. And so, now like she's progressing this project and, may want to work together or do something together with that down the road. And I think it could be quite interesting. It's like a very large project, operates at a very high level. So who knows how the future will unfold. But for me, I'm like a little bit like laying this strategic foundation for, a long-term opportunity. And in the short term, like it's just short-term trading value, and long-term, that's maybe where the ask or the opportunity arises.
Interesting. And on this, with you building a relationship with this person, how much do you think that yourself showing empathy and listening to what she was talking about, that's beyond any sort of superficial, like just hearing what they're saying, really listening and genuinely understanding her perspective and concerns, and then trying to help her with that? How important do you think is that in regards to building a relationship with this particular person?
Yeah, very important. And this particular person is very accomplished, has been a C-suite exec for a long time, has a very strong network of millionaires and billionaires because of the industry that they've been in, and is not necessarily a gatekeeper, but very careful about who they open their contact list with. So we've connected on obviously exchanging value, but on like multiple other things, like what our values are, our respective families, as well as like anecdotal moments and connection. And, we haven't gone into a fully solidified business relationship, but I wouldn't count that out, for the future. And so just understanding, I think I heard Naval say one time that business is just about finding the people who really need you, and vice versa. So it's not about like finding everyone. It's just there are people out there that really need you, and vice versa. So yeah.
And while you're building this relationship, I think it's good to speak about this particular example, because it just gives someone a story that they can grab onto and walk through together with us. Could you speak a little bit about also how important consistency is? Because this is a long-term relationship, and I think some people have heard things like fake it before you make it and things like this, but I disagree with that. I think you should be the person, and that way that whenever you're interacting with whomever the contact is, you don't have to try and put up a facade because it's real. And then what that does is that massively increases the amount of people you can have relationships with, because if you're just genuine all the time, you don't have to remember anything ever. You just be your honest self, or remember some of the things that this particular person who you're building relationships said previously and what their challenges are, and then you just be your honest self and help them in their life. Could you speak to that just in regards to consistency and in regards to relationship building?
Yeah, I think all the most successful people in the world are just brutally consistent. And yeah, they're just brutally consistent. They're just the same, and you know what you're going to get, and they're just the same like day in, day out. And they've combined consistency with excellence, but that consistency is like super important. That gives people a sense of stability and security and peace, which is like really important. Yeah, like being consistent with your values and with your vision is really important. It allows people to find like something to hook onto, like an anchor point, and understand like what you care about. Whereas if you're switching it up every 5 minutes, it'd be really difficult. And if I was to go back to my 18-year-old self, I'd probably say, hey, be a little bit more consistent. Like you don't have to make these like ginormous leaps. Just be super consistent in a few things, in a few areas, and your 1% daily improvement will compound over time. Whereas when I was a kid, I'd be like, do nothing, then try and do a big thing, then, like it'd be like going to the gym every once a month and just going nuts in that once a month session. It's like, better to just go to the gym and just hit like 5 sets of 5, every day, every second day, and just get that compounding benefit.
Yeah, because that compounded effort means more time in the gym than that once a month way of going about it.
Yeah, exactly. And I will say, like, even the nature of consistency and compounding, the place where I, bumped into this contact was at the gym that I've been going to consistently for like 3 years. And that's usually where we bump into each other and we have conversation. So, it's very like consistent and strategic. So yeah, the principle at play.
Yeah. And so that way, through being consistent, through listening to what this person said and what their challenges were, there's an opportunity that's arisen for you that's possibly going to take place in the future, which could be very lucrative.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. So how much individual attention would you have? I keep using this particular example, but yeah, I think it's good for people to follow along. How much would you remember about this individual, to gain these sort of relationships and to speak to people of this caliber? You need to remember them as an individual rather than some sort of generic customer or partner. So could you delve into a little bit what your strategy is on when you're networking with people like this, how you gain certain personal information and then how you use it to better foster the relationship moving forward?
Yeah, I think you can't fake it. Like, you just got to be like genuinely interested in people. If you're genuinely interested, then you're going to remember things and you're going to like circle back to like the last conversation you had or like various things. If you don't care, like as soon as you hear it, you'll forget and like, it's gone. So in order to, if I like take it a step back, like, yeah, okay, genuine caring is like important, but also you probably need like a little bit of internal emotional bandwidth to be able to care. Meaning, your internally you've got to have that space, to make room for like hearing different people, which means you've got to take care of yourself. You've got to be in a good frame of mind yourself. Because when you're like loaded, to the brim with your own problems, it's like hard to hear like other people's issues and problems and remember those because you become like really self-absorbed. So, just having everything like in the right order, like integrated internally.
Interesting. And then I fully agree with you that, there's not a problem.
Sorry, go ahead.
That was easy. Okay. So I fully agree with you that there is sort of a limit to how much you can remember. So when you're building relationships with people, if you're say stacking the deck, and if you're stacking the deck with really high quality cards, that means that later on, speaking about long-term relationships in multiple years in the future, let's say even you start from zero, you're going to have a deck of very high quality relationships. But if the people you're hanging around with are of lesser quality and you still stack your deck in years and years time, then you go back to look at your personal, black book of contacts, you're going to have a completely different black book to that person who's just been hanging around and trying to seek out higher quality people.
Yeah, and also like it compounds in a network as well. Like your reputation like compounds. I bumped into a friend of mine 2 days ago, like in a cafe, and hadn't seen them for a while. And then they said, and I said, oh, we actually have a mutual friend. And then so we were speaking about this person, and I was like, oh, this person's great, and like, just was speaking positively about this person, like behind her back. And then yesterday I was out at dinner and I bumped into that person and she was like, oh, we were just, this person and I, we were just talking about you. So it just kind of came like full circle. And that's happened like quite a few times. Like I said to a friend of mine last week, I was like, oh yeah, I was talking about you positively behind your back. Yes. So, that also happens too. Like it's curated like over time. Like people talk about positive interactions I'm sure they have with people. Like, I'm not aware of it, but I'm sure people talk about me behind my back as well.
Yes,
Yeah.
that is absolutely a thing. And I learned many, many years ago by a man named Alan Pease. He said some of the best way to build very fast, high level relationships with people is to get third party verification from someone they already like, know, and trust. So one example would be that, let's say you and I had just met and I was speaking about someone else positively to you, and that's someone that I just met. And later on, you go to that person and say, oh, you had this discussion with Jeromie. He spoke highly of you. The conversation went really well. Now that person has heard about me from you, and he's heard only good things. So then what that does is that raises my stock immensely with that particular person, because he's then got third-party verification from someone he already knows and trusts that, in this particular example, I'm a good person. And that is one of the fastest ways to build a high trust relationship with someone very, very quickly, is by leveraging someone else's trust and transparency that have already built up with that person that you're meeting.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Yeah, excellent point.
There's a very pertinent and excellent example of this recently, where you introduced me to someone that you'd known for a while and I'd known for one day. And we conducted a business transaction that most people wouldn't even ever possibly conceive on conducting in one day. But just based off the recommendation from you, we conducted this business transaction on the first day we met.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think, and this is built as well in regards to fostering high value relationships by starting off and leading with value. So could you please talk a little bit on what that would look like practically for any of our listeners? For any of our listeners, let's say we'll try and give a specific example to make it easy. Let's say that you've gone to a networking event and you're meeting certain people. What would be some of your go-tos to add value to them first, and how would you approach and start that relationship building process?
If you're at an event,
Yes, say for example, a networking event.
Yeah. I think probably it starts like before you get there. So, how you are internally, like your state of mind, your energy, your spirit. And that is very important because people can like feel your energy and read that. And then how you're dressed in your body language, like very important. People are just going to make subconscious reads. And then when you meet people, being able to look them in the eye, shake their hand, have a conversation, be interesting, listen. I can't stress enough how much like listening with intention and really listening and trying to understand is so much value in social interactions. Like asking questions and listening well is, I would say, like 80% of offering value in social settings. There's a saying that like the one who asks the questions, controls the negotiation. And I really think that's true. If you have high quality questions that are based out of curiosity and are, genuine and, furthering the conversation and you're trying to understand and lead and grow the conversation, then that's a huge value to people. That alone will do so much. The other thing that I heard recently, which I think is very smart if you're at a networking event, is it can be like quite stressful. You're meeting strangers, you're, maybe meeting new people. And one tip that I've also heard is like being someone who introduce, people to other people. So you hear something, make that connection, and you do exactly what you just described, but in real time. And you say, oh, you know what? Like you're into real estate. Like, let me introduce you to this guy. This guy's like, really great here. And you talk him up and you make that introduction. Suddenly, like, that's changed the dynamic and it's, brought some real value because it's expanding someone else's network. So being a good host and understanding that even if you're just a guest, being a good host also really helps to, further that as you go. At a networking event, like I would say, those are some of the foundational things to get it rolling.
I think it's incredibly important with the listening aspect, and also the who's asking the questions is in control in regards to any sort of negotiation or discussion. I think if anyone's been working on themselves and working on how to speak to people and how to extract the most value out of any particular conversation, I think and they've practiced it, they'll realize that they've possibly had a conversation with someone, let's say it was 15 minutes long, and they spoke for 2 or 3% of the total time of that conversation. The other person spent most of the time speaking, hopefully about themselves. They'll receive feedback from that person. Oh, that was a great conversation. I really enjoyed this conversation. And then you're thinking in your head, that was just me listening to you talk about yourself for 15 minutes. But the sweetest thing any particular person can hear is their own name. And also the sound of their voice. I got an example of this today. I filmed a podcast with someone else, very, very lovely guy. But when I was going over the post of the podcast, I was having a look at like the editing stuff, and you can see the sound files of when my guest was talking and the sound file of when I was talking. And I must have spoke 2 or 3% of the podcast. It was an hour long, and I was just asking 2 or 3 sentence questions, and then he talked for 5 or 10 minutes. And at the end of the podcast, after the filming, he was like, that was a great conversation. Like, I really enjoyed it. That was fantastic. I think that's just a really good example of, trying to network with people and give them what they want. And for most people, unless they're like so busy and overwhelmed that this can be a little bit different and they're a little bit more methodical, and they are just looking at what value you can get straight away. But those people are a bit rarer, and they're normally the high net worth, ultra high net worth individuals. But I think for most people, if you just get someone talking to you about themselves, and then try and really listen to them and find out what problems they're having in their life, and then help them with them, you can't really go wrong with that. That's a fantastic way to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree.
Yes. So in regards to these relationships, Jason, when do you start managing expectations and setting boundaries with these particular people? So using the example of this networking event, when and how would you start exerting boundaries? I'll give you one example that I might do. Let's say someone is up and coming in a particular industry, and I meet them and they ask me for help, and I say, yeah, not a problem. And they start messaging me every day. Then I'll message them pretty much straight away and say, look, I'm okay helping you. This is not a problem, but you're not paying me, and I'm doing this out of the kindness of my heart. So don't message me every day with a problem that you've just thought of. Try Google first. Try fix it yourself. And then once you've tried a couple of times to fix it, if it's still a problem, come to me. I'll happily help you. But this messaging me every day stuff's got to stop.
Yeah, I mean, you're always teaching people how to treat you, right? So your behavior, like it's from the beginning. Again, it's like consistent. You're always teaching people like how to treat you. So anything to do with boundaries is absolutely necessary, and it's necessary from the very beginning. But you may not need to express it overtly because, that maybe there's mutual respect or whatever. But that's always like from the very beginning, and it's always consistent all the way through. It just depends like when you might have to bring that up, but it's absolutely critical.
We're back.
Okay, I just dropped off.
All right, let's wrap up fairly quickly then, and then in the post I'll see if we lost any of it. How about that?
Okay.
All right, fantastic. So one last point, then how would you maintain these relationships over time moving forward?
Yeah, maintaining relationships, it's like with anything, like it just takes, it's like watering a garden, like taking care of a garden. So maintaining relationships is about like, just watering that garden and having touch points, and doesn't have to be big or extravagant. It can just be like, over time. I think the reality is like you have concentric circles of relationships where you have like an inner circle and, becomes larger and larger, to acquaintances. But in order to, I heard that the average person like can really only maintain or like have a network of about 120 close relationships. Like after that, you need some like systems and some structure and some order. So anything above, like any size, like above, requires like some systems and some structure. But I think like with anything, it's like some kind of like consistency, some kind of like regularity. Now that may be seasonal, it may be, every now and then, but I think that is kind of required. Otherwise relationships, end up, running out of steam to some degree. But what are your thoughts?
I think this is an important part of the process, and this absolutely should be followed, because if you find or meet someone that you do want to have a great relationship with moving forward, the more touch points you have with that person, the better. I think it's incredibly important that if you are interacting with this person, it starts to feel awkward or weird, you need to cut that off straight away and move on. But at the same time, have more touch points. So one way to do that would possibly be, if there's a person that you are looking to build a relationship with long term, is try to keep them front of mind, or have a reminding system in some way to remind you to reach out to them, and reach out to them with some information that would be valuable to them. So you may remember some things they speak about. Let's say they're interested in American politics. If you're interested in that as well, and you find something that is not necessarily in the mainstream media, but was interesting to you, it's likely going to be interesting to them as well. And if they're not delving in those smaller forms of media, maybe to post on X or something like that, send them a message. Say, hi person, I was just thinking about you. I was watching this article. I thought you might be interested in it. Just reach out whenever you like, if you've got time. Thanks. And then just send them the thing. That way you've got a touch point. You've led with some value. You've given them something that they're probably interested in and they haven't seen. And I think that's a great way to keep in touch and add more touch points with relationships.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point.
So yeah, okay, is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up in regards to building and maintaining long-term relationships?
No, I think only that like some people are naturally really good at it. And for a lot of other people, like it's, it maybe not be like 100% natural, and like you've got to work on it. I'm by nature like to spend time by myself. So I find like networking events, or I enjoy them, but I find them like to be exhausting. And so you got to find like a little bit like what works for you. Like if you're an introvert, like your medium might be like more text, and more messages and more one-on-one. If you're extroverted, you might be fine with like YouTube channel and like large personal brand. Like, so you got to find what fits for you based on like your personality and your preferences. That would be my only other like last tip. But, the quality of your life is really determined by, in a sense, the quality of the questions you ask yourself, and also the quality of the relationships you have around you. So the better you're able to curate, those relationships, the better your life is going to be.
Okay, fantastic. I think that's a great way to end the podcast. So for all of the listeners, or maybe people viewing, if you want to reach out to us, you can reach out to us on j3vc.com. If you've liked what you heard today, subscribe to our podcast, and I'll see you on the next episode.
Great. See you.